Welcome to today's episode of Inside Legal ESG. We are so pleased to have with us today David Hunter. If you were to look at his LinkedIn profile, it would say tempered radical servant leader, flawed earth steward, and finally, lawyer. So David, I want to start with, tell me about that. Tell me about your career and how did you get to do work in this space? Because clearly you have been a man ahead of your time. You've been working in this space for a long time.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Pamela, and thanks so much for the invitation to have a conversation with you today. In the world of law, I can probably take the ahead of my time compliment. I think in the wider world, I don't think I was at all, really. I was kind of catching up. And probably the turning point for me was back in 2010. I did a master's the master's was called Sustainability and Responsibility, kind of in business practice. And through that, I learned about some of those things that have found their way into that LinkedIn profile. So tempered radical is a concept that I'm sure some of your listeners might be aware of, in terms of, feeling like within organizations like a law firm, you feel like a radical, and when you step out of a law firm and engage with some of the people that are interested in these sorts of topics, you feel very far from it. Mm-hmm. So it's that sort of always feeling slightly on the edge, but in the professional context, trying to use my place and leverage within the profession to shift the dial a little bit, rather than simply throwing brickbats and criticisms from outside. Mm-hmm. So that's where that comes in. Servant leadership is I think Robert Greenleaf back in the 1970s, a very long time ago, in the business world, came up with this concept, and it resonates with me very much as a sense of leadership isn't about title, it isn't about power, it's about service and understanding how you can use the influence that you have in order to further sort of general societal well-being. Earth stewardship, I'm sure again many are familiar with, and the flawed comes very much from despite best intentions, I know I'm probably leaving a heavier footprint than I would wish to. So it's probably always going to be a work in progress. And if it just says lawyer at the end, I think for a while it used to say activist lawyer, and trying to emphasize the fact that we have the capacity as lawyers to help move things along, and that's what I'm trying to do now in my work, and also in the fringes of it, and in the way that we sort of engage with others, through that.
So let's go back to that activist lawyer phrase. Have you been in this space your entire legal career? Because much like you, I feel like lawyers have an outsized role to play in helping society transition or transform or whatever to the new more viable economy might be. And it seems like you've been using your legal skills and talents to help shepherd the whole profession in this direction.
So I qualified about getting on for 30 years ago. And I would probably say that for roughly half of that time, then I was a commercial lawyer. I didn't really think too much about the consequences of the work I was doing. It was reasonably challenging intellectually. It was reasonably challenging in terms of the time commitment it was making on me, and it was well remunerated, but and that was kind of it. But over time, I began to think a bit more about my my place in the world, and how I felt about that. And that course I mentioned was a bit of a pivotal role, and sort of whilst I was on that course, I was thinking a lot harder about how could I use my position and skills to have positive impact. And I'd always been vaguely aware of this firm called Bates Wells and Braithwaite in London, that kind of seem to focus on that sort of work and try and think a bit more about the impact of what they did. So I just wrote to them. I wrote to the managing partner and said, "You're the you seem like the sort of firm that I should be working for." And maybe it's a reflection of that culture that he called me and we had a chat, and he said, "Well, let's give it a go and see what happens." And that was 2011. So since then, it's been a lot easier to try and to do things. Bateswells have been very accommodating in terms of that experimentation, and not simply saying, well, if there's not a business case for it, we're not going to do it.
Right.
And happily during that time, actually, there has been a degree of convergence between what we're trying to do and what the world needs and what the market's trying to do as well. So that's been fortuitous.
And we also have a podcast episode with Angela Monahan from
Wow,
Bateswells. So yeah, we got a great story of the Bateswells journey, which has been very impressive indeed. Some of the work you're doing in the profession includes your involvement with Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. Tell me about that. How did it get started? Who's involved, and what's the purpose and mission?
Sure. So Net Zero Lawyers got going in the summer of 2021 prior to the COP in Glasgow, and it came out of the Race to Zero program and was an attempt to. Lawyers have been a bit slow to engage with the whole climate issue, but there's a barrister called Wendy Miles, who's a sort of international barrister, and she took it upon herself to try and create a place for lawyers to engage in these conversations and do some things. So it's great credit to Wendy that she had the vision and the energy to see that. So at the moment, it's now 30 plus law firms, most of which are in big international law firms, and there's a very conscious decision to try and reach out to other continents and to make sure it's not entirely Anglo-centric or Anglo-American centric, but that's where it seems to started out. And those firms have made a commitment to in terms of how they're going to behave as businesses themselves, particularly in terms of addressing their own emissions and have their own net zero targets and measure and report against those. But also to commit to sort of educate their staff to make sure that they're equipped to advise properly on climate and broader sustainability and ESG related matters, and also to try and use law as a tool to shift the dial and to ensure that we sort of achieve net zero in a broader sense, and that's been primarily to date through looking at sort of big international levers and trying to shift those things like the Energy Charter Treaty and the way UNCITRAL, which is a UN initiative, work, and looking at the sort of international finance architecture to see if changes can be brought in at that level that potentially has that kind of ripple effect or that sort of leverage. If you sort of shift it a few percent here, then as it goes through the system, that influence expands. So that's the sort of originating concept behind it. We've been looking at things like trying to take a position on the antitrust competition law debate and give an alternative way of expressing that to maybe some of that's been certainly emerged in the States to date. Looking at things like fiduciary duty, and is there a way to use our collective knowledge to have a sort of a positive look at how that may change in the future to make it easier to adopt some of the positions that we need to address some of the challenges that we face, and something that perhaps hopefully we might have time to touch on at the end in terms of how law firms can use their influence with clients and shift the client relationship perhaps to again to look at reducing emissions through the advice that's associated, the emissions associated with the advice that we give. It's very much built around these big firms making a big pro bono commitment and using their expertise and skills to to try and develop these new and progressive positions in various legal fields, and about collaborating, and rather than competing and coming up with positions that maybe will be able to carry more weight because it's got a number of firms saying, yes, we've collectively come to this view and we support it.
So you use the word pro bono. Is everything you've just talked about really only applying to the work that clients take on, or excuse me, that law firms take on a pro bono basis, or is it applying to their whole client base?
So this is more in the context of saying, look, these firms are going to commit their time and resource to these new initiatives, which will then hopefully have an impact across the profession and across business and across investment, without expecting there to be a client who's going to pay them for doing it.
Yeah, understood. Excellent. So tell me about your time at Bates Wells. You touched on it a little bit earlier that you joined them, I think you said in 2011.
Yeah.
How has, number one, the work you're doing evolved over those years, and how has Bates Wells as a firm evolved over those years?
So I mean, on a personal level, one of the things that was quite extraordinary, I suppose, in retrospect, because when I joined Bates Wells, I didn't do the sort of work that they did, and I didn't have the sort of clients that they advised. So it really was almost like starting out again for me, and they gave me the time to learn and to build up my own practice, which was great. As I say, this sense of convergence has been happening quite a bit all the way through that. So sort of in 2015, as B Corps came to the UK, we were advising B Lab to set up the UK charity that would run the B Corp process in the UK, and through that, the partnership decided to become a B Corp itself. So we were the first UK law firm to be a B Corp, and I think we still are. And we've been through the certification process sort of three times now, and and that's been a great boon to us in terms of making it easy for others outside to understand who we are and what we're about, and also internally to have a sort of a very sort of collegiate sense of that, which has been really great and powerful for us, I think. But it's also, I think, representative of so Bates Wells began as a firm advising charities, and it was almost like purely not for profit. And then as the concept of social enterprise and social investment became more sort of visible and relevant, it moved into that space, and now we're very much in the purposeful business space, and again, thinking about impact, it's trying to, rather than be a little niche that does lots of nice things but doesn't really have any impact on the wider economy or society, being able to try and shift the dial in the more sort of mainstream corporate space. And I think that's particularly interesting for me. And in fact, sort of where we've got to now is clearly it's really important that Bates Wells continues to have that sort of purity, if you like, in terms of a lot of the work that we do and who we work for. But at the same time, part of the reason I'm interested in things like Net Zero Lawyers Alliance is because in terms of impact and really shifting things from where we are now to where we need to be, it's some of the bigger commercial firms have more leverage than we do. So that piece of committing pro bono to collaborate with some of the big firms in net zero is so that we can hopefully help them sort of make, and I don't mean this in a sort of way of suggesting that we're better than them, but sort of, if we can bring them towards sort of the way we've been doing law for a few years, and help them in turn sort of advise their clients a bit more on some of these issues, then actually that impact is going to be much bigger than us carry on doing what we've always done. So that feels like a bit of a potential sweet spot to focus on.
And so you mentioned that Bates Wells started with, representing charitable and not-for-profit organizations, and has since moved into more commercial enterprises that have a social mission or a social purpose. Do you turn down work if the company isn't of that makeup?
It's not so much that if they aren't actively positive, we wouldn't take them on necessarily, but we certainly do look closely at businesses that we think might be causing actual harm and decide no, you're not for us. And in fact, one of the things that we're going through right at the moment, so in 2019 we published some climate commitments we made back then in terms of what we would do to try and respond to the climate emergency. And actually just now we're going through another internal process of refining that further, and it is very much around that question of, okay, how do we if we want to present ourselves as being about positive impacts, then it can't just be about sort of what we're doing, but what we're not doing. And so what does that look like, and where are the parameters that we'll put around that? And so we've drafted a pledge which we intend to put on our website and hold ourselves accountable to, which is about being a sustainable and responsible business, and what we mean by sustainable, using the Brundtland definition, about making sure that future generations, are able to fulfill their needs, and being responsible in terms of thinking about things like advised emissions, thinking about things like biodiversity loss, just transition, and trying to have that holistic approach to how we work with clients. But it's still the emphasis is very much more on trying to be positive and helping them necessarily than sort of saying, well, if historically you've been bad, we don't want to know.
Right, right.
If we can.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. For instance, there are groups out there that are ranking and rating law firms with respect to whether or not they work with fossil fuel companies. And I think that's the wrong metric. I think the metric is, it doesn't matter if you're working for fossil fuel companies. It matters what kind of work you're doing for them.
Absolutely.
Because if the work you're doing for fossil fuel companies is to help them transition to better ways of doing things, more power to you. Yeah. But if the work you're doing for fossil fuel companies is anything and everything to fight carbon regulation, then yeah, that's something to be looked at. Yeah. Do you advise clients on ESG, how to get to B Corp certification? I mean, is that a service line for you to help your clients get where you are?
Yeah, I mean, very much so in terms of B Corp certification. We do a lot in that space. And we also do a lot of work with clients who don't necessarily want B Corp certification, but want to behave like B Corps and want to understand what that may mean in terms of their governance arrangements, and what that may mean in terms of maybe how they go about contracting, or and how they work with their supply chains, and and getting into that broader sort of ESG space. We've tended not to go big on the ESG label, I think, because partly that it's kind of what we've done always. It seems possibly slightly like stepping backwards into it, and possibly it's a bit more, feels a bit constraining. Whether that's true or not, I don't honestly know. But again, I think we're more we prefer to talk about it as a business who's trying to behave in that way to other businesses who wish to do so, and sort of being that sort of conversation rather than a compliance conversation, or sort of what can we get away with and call ourselves
and still, yeah. And I also believe this to be true, that right now ESG is hot. And so law firms are packaging it and putting together practice groups and calling it ESG. Yeah. But I believe that eventually ESG will just be part of everything that lawyers do, right? You will take those things into consideration from every practice group for every client industry, and it's not going to be a separate thing. I interviewed a lawyer from a law firm, and I commented, how come you don't have ESG listed on your website? And he said, because if we listed an ESG practice group, it would include every single lawyer in the firm, because that's the mindset, that's the lens through which we are serving our clients. And I think eventually the whole industry will get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, because that's the way the economy needs to function.
Yes.
You know, it's exactly mindset, as you say, and that's what this pledge I mentioned is about. It's trying to demonstrate and develop and internalize a mindset that you are thinking along those lines, and taking all of those interdependencies into account in providing advice, and in terms of how you, as I say, how you relate on that client basis as well.
Yep, I completely agree. One of the things we talked about prior to this recording was the work that the Law Society is doing. And you mentioned the Law Society Climate Change Working Group. I would love for you to describe for our audience what that is and what the outcome will be.
Sure. So, I mean, that it's interesting how that came about, because actually in some very enterprising lawyers in back in 2020 realized that, I mean, the Law Society was pretending climate change didn't exist, and it was sort of nothing to do with lawyers. But a few enterprising lawyers realized that it only took about 12 signatures to be able to put a motion on the ballot for the general meeting, or the agenda for the general meeting, and so wanted to put a no confidence motion up in relation to the Law Society's stance or absence of a stance on climate change. So they scrambled and
were
said,
you
look,
one of those scrambling?
well, I was one of the 12 that got the Law Society scrambling.
Okay.
So we got,
that's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Yeah. We got the rest. I mean, I wasn't enterprising enough to go through the regulations to work out this was all it was going to take. But
yes,
when the call went out, was, can we have some people to sign up? Then yeah, I happily was invited to join that. So anyway, the Law Society said, please don't put this forward as a formal resolution, and if you don't, we will set up a working group to to engage with climate change seriously. So the resolution was withdrawn, and they went through a process of recruiting to form this working group. And again, I was fortunate enough to get through that process, and they quite rightly tried to be quite representative, as the Law Society is, of the profession as a whole. So it was some people from big city firms, it was some people from who work in house, it was some environmental lawyers, it was some more sort of campaigning lawyers, it was people from small firms. So it was it was a good cross section. And first of all, we managed to come up with a draft a resolution prior to the Glasgow COP that became the Law Society's statement on climate change itself. So that was about what it was going to do as a business, what it was going to do as to support the profession, and what it both urged and encouraged solicitors to do themselves. And part of that was a commitment to provide guidance to the profession on what they needed to do in response to the climate crisis. That was what we spent most of 2022 working on, and it is now going through, I believe, the final internal formalities within the Law Society to be published, hopefully in March this year, so next month. And I mean, it proved quite a very interesting but quite difficult exercise, because the society is so broad and it's trying to speak to everybody across the profession. There was a danger that it would end up saying nothing.
Right.
And it also needed to be very concise. So to sort of tick those boxes and still be valuable was a bit of a challenge, but hopefully I think we've got there. It's trying to cover looking at helping solicitors understand what the risks are to themselves and to their clients, and what the sort of and how to go about approaching that. Looking at the impact of these risks on our professional duties and the interrelation between those. And in some quarters it's been very easy to sort of say, oh well, we have a duty to advise anyone who walks through the door, which isn't strictly true. There is right to representation, but that is framed in context, which mean obviously you have some discretion for the most part whether you're going to take on particular clients or particular work or not. So clarifying some of that, clarifying what it may mean in terms of things like needing to think about acting with integrity. Well, what does that mean in a context when you know that the product of your advice may cause material harm to great many people? And it's we've been right, I think, not to say you must not act in these circumstances, but I think we're trying to say you might want to think about this.
Right.
You might want to think about where you stand on this, and think about the direction of travel and what this is going to mean to your business in the next in the coming years. And also think about not just the impact of climate change on you as a solicitor or a business, but the impact that you have on climate change and the wider world. What in the financial sector is being described as double materiality. So that inside out perspective as well as the outside in one, which the EU has picked up on. And it was interesting to see what's coming out of the Montreal Biodiversity Convention late last year. Again, they're talking about needing to look at things in these terms. So I think and it has to be right. Over it takes us a while to be prepared to have that sort of lens shift. But if we are going to address the problems that we face, we can't only look at it in one direction and not the other, because that's not the way the world works.
Right. I am really looking forward to that guidance being published, because I think there are law societies, or here in the US we call them bar associations, that need to also do the same thing. I mean, I'm not seeing much action at all from the bar associations here in the United States. So it will be really good to have an example of perhaps some commitments that could be made from the profession. One thing I want to get to before we have to wrap up, and that is, we were just starting to touch on it, advised emissions. And that falls right into the double materiality bucket, right? It's not just what a law firm itself is doing with respect to its impact on society. It is the work we do for clients and the impact of that work. So how do you assess that? How do you evaluate that? How do you make decisions about advised emissions?
Well, we're still trying to work that out.
Well, kudos to you, because I think most law firms aren't even giving it consideration yet. So kudos to you for trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, this is one of the sort of the sub projects of Net Zero Lawyers. So it's by no means unique to Bates Wells, but there's probably a dozen firms through Net Zero Lawyers have come together. And step one is acknowledging that that's a valid, it's potentially where we can have most influence.
Right.
If all we're doing is making sure that our direct emissions are in delivering advice are reduced to net zero, actually that's not going to change things much. But if we can work with our clients on the difficult stuff, then that's where our impact is. So step one is sort of acknowledging that and being willing to say, okay, well, we need to do something about it. Step two is the kind of okay, what does that look like? Where we've got to so far is, and because the sort of the goal is getting emissions down at the sort of speed and scale that we need to, that the IPCC have told us we need to. So the terminology and the focus has been on the emissions, but I think what we're realizing is we could spend the rest of the century trying to work out the best way to count the emissions and work out how to allocate them in different situations when you've got depending on which party you're advising in a big development that's going to create lots of emissions, and we could be arguing internally about that for forever. So it's what we're trying to do now is develop a methodology of engagement, really. So it's saying, okay, well, how are we going to what conversations are we going to have with clients to understand, do they have a transition plan? Is it, how credible is it? If they come to us with asking us to advise on a matter, is it consistent with their transition plan? If it's not, are there extenuating reasons why not? Is it because actually this is a way to get from some kind of, it is, as you said earlier, one of those that they're really trying, but they're going to have to, there's going to be a blip in order to get to the point where they are reducing. And do we go along with that, or are we skeptical? And trying to work out some sort of standards or principles that we can all use, so we're having those conversations. Then when it comes to matters, we're saying, okay, there's a great opportunity here to to work with a client on their transition pathway. And if we're doing that, then our emissions are going to be coming down relative to the work we were doing for them 5 years ago. Or are we actually going to say, we're not convinced that they are doing that, but there's these fantastic guys over here who are doing things that we really want to get involved in. And then there's the internal conversations as well. They're kind of, okay, if you're having to say to a colleague, do you know what, the really lucrative work you've been doing for the last decade is sort of out of fashion now, and will be forevermore here. So, but we're not going to throw you on the scrap heap. Actually, there's going to be loads of work coming up in terms of adaptation and resilience and climate repair. So, we'll invest in you to build a practice around all of these nascent service lines, because we want you and we want us to be leading in that field. So it's, rather than it being, again, that kind of negative, just slamming the door, it's, okay, how do we pivot, and how do we do that in a way which at the same time doesn't then mean effectively it's business as usual, because we've just found a way to, on the one hand, say, we're doing all the good stuff, but actually we're still doing the same, the sort of predatory delay stuff that Alex Steffen talks about.
Yes. And all of your comments that you just made were under the E pillar of ESG, but I would argue that the same holds true under the social practices and governance practices, and what we're helping our clients do or encouraging them not to do under ESG, in order to ensure the transition or the transformation to a new society that is so sorely needed.
Exactly right. So we I mean, whether this proves correct or not, who knows, but we took the view that rather than try and do everything in one hit, given the sort of the existential nature of the climate crisis, if we could get traction on the E, then it is actually the same mindset that applies to the S and the G. And once you're doing it in one space, why wouldn't you do it in the others as well? So, we're trying to do it in bite-sized chunks rather than sort of, boil the ocean, so to speak.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been an incredible conversation. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I want to thank you for being a tempered, radical servant leader lawyer, because you truly have been leading the way. Thank you again.
Well, it's a pleasure, always a pleasure talking to you, Pam, and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you.